photographs and things like the snakes' head fritillaries. I think you've got some lovely photographs.
Yeah, of course. So Wildflowers of the Queen is a celebration of wildflowers in their meadows. You know, it was set up obviously the Coronation Meadow project for the 60th Jubilee, nearly 10 years ago. And sort of Hugo's the aim was to make the invisible visible, which obviously he's done here with the butterfly orchid. And the butterfly orchid, its common name obviously because it sort of resembles the butterfly wings almost. And it's so special being here in the meadow today because you really get to realise the sounds, the smells, the colours, the whole atmosphere, which Hugo wanted to bring forward in the book, making these tiny jewels sort of visible for all, and sort of with the more visibility and the more sort of awareness, then legal protection would come, because there's sort of with wildflowers, and Matt will confirm as well, there's sort of not much legal protection for them. You could easily mow down, sort of endangered or red listed sort of species without knowing. And so showcasing fragile and wildflowers was the aim of the book. And this obviously is the bee orchid here, which is it was photographed at Jones Hill, and obviously, as you can sort of see as well, the flowers are so small, sometimes the petals even the size of a thumbnail. So in sort of big spaces like this, trying to find these sort of beautiful tiny gems was a real challenge, and I'll go over that more later in one of the stories. But the connection to Hugo's work and also to the Coronation Meadows project, I'll read a little excerpt here from the book, because the floral emblems have been part of the royal story as far back as the War of the Roses. For the Queen's coronation, however, they were central to the inclusion of an essential new and exciting part of the royal story. And the Queen's coronation dress was made by Norman Hartnell, who also made her wedding dress. It was covered with thousands of seed pearls and made of white satin embroidered with emblems of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. And so sort of the connection today, sort of, it was the same for then, which is a rose for England, a thistle for Scotland, a leek for Wales, a shamrock for Ireland, lotus flower for India and Ceylon, and sugar bush flower for South Africa, the water blossom for Australia, wheat and jute for Pakistan, the maple leaf for Canada, and a fern for New Zealand. And obviously then the shots that Hugo took in the book, Wildflowers for the Queen, is similar to his connection with the previous book, The Queen's People, where he used the same mirrors and the same techniques that he used on the Queen for these flowers, sort of showcasing them as sort of the stars of the show, just like he did with the Queen.
It's worth just holding that second one up, because that's a snake's head. I don't know how many people would recognise the snake's head fritillary, so that's one of the very rare plants that you would get in these kinds of water meadows. So.
Yeah, and this one obviously was grown, so obviously you can't pick these wildflowers. This one was grown in Hugo's own garden, local to here. And obviously, as it's a mirrored shot, there was only one of them which he took up and then replanted, so there wasn't the four. But that was obviously the snake's head fritillary.
Matt, do you want to fill us in on how the Coronation Meadows project is going 10 years on?
So I'll talk about Coronation Meadows, So I mean, the project was initiated 10 years ago, and Prince Charles is the patron of Plantlife, so he came to us and said, I want to create some meadows across the country. I'd like to create a meadow in every county. And we thought, well, we'll take up that challenge and see how we get on with that. So, and this sort of work probably hadn't been done at that scale before, so it was a bit of a challenge for Plantlife, but I mean, we're quite a resourceful charity, I think. So, and we work with lots of other organisations and partners, and people came forward and sort of said, we've got some land, we'd love to create a wildflower meadow. And we worked with some of the wildlife trusts who also had bits of land, and they said, we'd like to create a meadow. And we were looking for, so the idea and the principle of the project was to find a very, very good example of a really high quality wildflower meadow in each county, and that would be used as the source of seed. So that would become the donor meadow. So seed would be collected from that meadow, and then it would be taken to the receptor meadow, which was the one that was fairly uninteresting, and that seed would either be collected either by hand or with a machine, or it would be cut as green hay, and it would be spread on these new meadows, in effect, to create another new meadow in every county. So that happened over 10 years ago, and we're sort of now, that work, I suppose, that kind of principle of natural seeding, I guess is what we're calling it. So using seed that's local, to create local meadows for local people. That sounds like something else. So so that principle is what we're now using really in a lot of the work that Plantlife is doing. That idea, it's about local diversity of plants, and it's about the genetic diversity as well. So plants vary considerably across the country. Even the same species will be genetically subtly different. So a plant that's in the north may well flower slightly different at a different time to a plant in the south. And this idea of using local seed is to try and maintain that genetic diversity and that link back to these local meadows. So so that work continues really, and in fact it's kind of gone from strength to strength. So.
And do people just sort of get in touch with Plantlife when they're kind of keen to maybe?
Yeah, I mean, so as a charity and as an organisation, I mean, we obviously deal with lots and lots of inquiries, and myself and other colleagues go out and give advice to landowners about the creation and restoration of wildflower meadows. And I think Ian might touch on a bit more of that later. We're doing a lot of work around grasslands in the coming years, and I'll leave that to Ian to talk about.
And later on, there's going to be a question and answer, so you can ask any practical questions of Matt or Erin if you wish. But Erin, I'm dying to hear this story about how Hugo went to go and try and find the lady orchid.
Yeah.
Meadow.
Just jumping in with what Matt said as well, obviously the 90th meadow is the one in Green Park, so central London, and going back to the seeds, they had school children sowing the seeds, as well as sort of the horses that were sort of with them as well. So it was a real sort of showcase of London and how wildflower meadows can be in the centre of a big city. And Hugo photographed it with joggers going through it, sort of commuting to work, and buses passing. So it's it doesn't just have to be sort of out in the countryside. They can sort of be all over.
Indeed, exactly, which is why obviously I'm sure a lot of you are gardeners here, and you've probably got bits of green space that you could potentially create or think about how you might turn that into a slightly more wild area or a wildflower meadow. So
But yes, so the lady orchid here. So the lady orchid, named the lady orchid as she's sort of in a crimson crinoline ball gown. I hope you can all see. And the sort of scientific name, which Matt's probably better at, is Orchis purpurea. And this is on the first of the shoots. There's 19 meadows in the book. This was the first of the shoots. And Hugo was given the GPS coordinates to find this lady orchid on the first day he arrived. And sort of he arrived to the meadow, and sort of the lady orchid was nowhere to be seen. And he thought it would be pretty easy, as it was only sort of half a metre high. So he thought he'd be able to spot it. But that didn't happen. So we spent the whole day trying to find the lady orchids, and it got to around sort of 4 or 5 o'clock, which on a day like today would be fine for photographing, but it was sort of cloudy and overcast, so he had to come back the next day with the new coordinates and find this lady orchid. So he set his alarm for sort of 4 or 5 a.m, which is very typical when shooting obviously these meadows in the morning when the sun's coming up, and it's sort of undisturbed and untouched, or so he thought. And so he sort of tracked down the lady orchid and sort of positioned himself sort of, at the level, all the camera ready, everything set up, and a crash bang wallop, a herd of deer came flying past and took out the lady orchid, which is sort of then sort of back to square one and trying to find the next one. And obviously there's no rhyme or reason to them. He's sort of very used to photographing gardens and garden design books, so everything's laid out. But with wildflower meadows, it's in the name, it's wild. There's no sort of rhyme or reason or real sort of pattern to where they are. And but eventually he did find it. He did find another one, which is the lady orchid at Ranscombe Farm. And just as an example of where he was trying to find it, obviously you're trying to find one sort of orchid or two in sort of a space. Thanks, Matt. In a space like this. So it's almost like Where's Wally? You're trying to sort of find these sort of...
like an air stewardess.
Except we're paying attention.
Yeah. So yeah, so it was playing hard to get, but it also comes back to the fact that they're so magical and they are tiny jewels, and when you do find them, it's so special because they're not sort of all over the place. Some of these orchids, or sort of the more rarer plants and flowers.
Yes, when I first came here, and I hate to say this to you, but it was about this time last year, but about 2 weeks later, or maybe it was the same time, and there were lots of them just over there. And we've seen, Matt can show you, they are coming up. You can see the spotted leaf.
Yes.
But Matt, could you just talk about one of the main things with people making meadows is managing their expectations.
Yes. Yeah. I suspect anyone who's tried to make a wildflower meadow, or even just tried to leave an area of grass a bit long, and maybe has seen quite a lot of grass come up, has kind of been a little bit disheartened and thought, well, this is not really going to do anything, or maybe they bought one of those little seed bombs from somewhere online and they've just kind of thrown it into the grass and sort of expected miraculous things to happen, and you know, in a year's time it's going to just be full of brightly coloured flowers. But unfortunately the reality is that you kind of have to sort of set yourself up and think this is going to be a little bit of a long-term endeavour really with these things. So you know, if Plantlife approaches this kind of project and we talk to a landowner, what we generally will do is we'll try and get as much of an understanding about the place as possible. So we're trying to understand about the soil. We're trying to understand about the fertility of the soil, because that obviously has a bearing on how well the grass will grow. The more fertile the soil is, the more the grass will grow, and therefore that will be more of a battle to get wildflowers to establish. So that's a really important thing to understand. So I mean, I'm sure the gardeners amongst us are quite interested in soil and understanding about fertility, but of course it's the reverse for wildflowers. You know, generally if you're trying to establish wildflower, you know, garden plants, you're trying to improve the soil and get it more fertile so that flower grows big. But if you do that in a meadow context, the grass just grows really vigorously. So we're trying to always choose places where it's quite low in fertility. So that's one thing to think about when you're trying to create an area for wildflowers or a meadow. So the soil is really important. The other thing is the soil pH as well. So some soil is very acidic, some soil is very alkaline, and again, some wildflowers, just like garden plants, will do better on depending on how acidic or alkaline the soil is. So again, understanding that again helps to manage one's expectations, because that's always good, so we don't get too excited and carried away. And also it helps us to think about what kind of plants might come back there naturally, or what plants we might want to try and introduce as well, because some plants are very fussy, just like, you know, garden plants would be fussy as well. So those things are really important. So those are the things, those are the givens, the things we can't change, obviously. I mean, we wouldn't encourage people to try and change the fertility of the soil necessarily. Some people say we've got to scrape all the soil away or something like that, but we wouldn't generally do that. And obviously we don't want to change the pH. You might do that in a garden context, but generally we'd rather just work with what you've got, and then you're going to get a natural community of wildflowers. And then the other side of the coin is the management. And that's the commitment to long-term management that really makes wildflower meadows work. So we sort of think of wildflower meadows and we look at them and think, oh, they're this wonderful natural place, but of course really they are a result of people interacting with the land and the soil and the plants and the management, you know. So we, you know, as I said earlier, you know, we've been managing the land in this country for sort of 6,000–7,000 years, you know, and some of the meadows that are probably our best examples have probably been managed in the same way for maybe 60, 70 or 100 years, and that's why they've got so many wildflowers. So that management is really important, and what that management does is take away the crop, it takes away the grass, and therefore it's starting to reduce the fertility of the soil. And the more you do that, and the more consistently you can do that, and even in a garden space, you can cut and you can remove the grass, that will start to reduce the fertility, and that potentially will allow some space for some other wildflowers to get going. So that's the sort of basic principles really of sort of creating and managing a wildflower meadow. There's a bit more to it than that, but that's the sort of...
What, do you have to have livestock intervention at any point? I mean, what if you...
I mean, if you're in a sort of large scale like we are here, you know, in a field scale, I mean, livestock are quite an important part of doing that because they're a bit more sustainable than cutting it. But if you're in a garden context, you've obviously got the opportunity to use other machine. You know, you can use machinery to cut and remove the grass. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be livestock. But the fundamental thing about making wildflower meadows work is the regularity of management, so that annual cutting and removing of the grass, which is something that people don't always realise. So the area behind us that few people have wandered through, and you're very welcome to go and have a look at, it's being cut every year. So it's not cut until the flowers have flowered and they've set their seed, because obviously if you do that, you lose the potential for some of those flowers to grow back in there. But it is always cut, and the cuttings are always taken away and removed. And gradually over time you get more plants, more wildflowers, and lower fertility in the soil, and that's really how these meadows came about in the first place. It was that combination of things.
And then the yellow rattle, which is the sort of one always hears, this kind of magic bullet plant. Is it absolutely key? Do you always have to have? I mean, is it as important as it seems? I
mean, yellow rattle's an interesting plant. Historically, it was in lots of our hay meadows. So these meadows that were managed by farmers for probably for centuries, and it was called hay rattle. They considered it a pest because basically it's a semi-parasite, so in effect it takes away some of the nutrients from the grass and it suppresses the grass. So if you're trying to grow a crop of hay for your farm and you've got lots of yellow rattle in it, it's a problem. And of course, before the advent of pesticides and the changing of our meadows and the changing of sort of agricultural practice, you know, a lot of our meadows would have looked like the one behind us. So you know, it wasn't, you know, farmers kind of, it was a bit of the bane of their lives. But of course now a lot of people are creating and managing meadows purely for wildlife. They're not necessarily so concerned about, you know, making lots of productive grassland. So, you know, hay rattle is really important in that context, or yellow rattle, because it's this semi-parasite and it will suppress the grasses. So in this field, for example, where the grass is really, really lush, it would be very, very challenging to try and get wildflowers to establish in here as it is at the moment. So what we would probably talk about doing is maybe trying to get some yellow rattle introduced and getting the rattle really, really well growing, and that could take maybe 3, 4, 5 years before that rattle really spreads through the meadow. And once that starts to spread, and if you look across next door, you'll see there's patches where the rattle is growing and the grass is really short, and then you look next door and the grass is really long and there's no rattle. So you can really see the effect of the yellow rattle on suppressing the grass. And so of course that does, it starts to open up and you start to see gaps and you can start to see a little bit of bare soil between the grass. And of course that's the opportunity that the other wildflower seeds need. They need that space really. So the rattle is really quite an important, it's, I mean, why we call it the meadow maker.
Ah, yes, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a bit about the No Mow May?
Me?
Yes.
Oh.
Well, I'm afraid that's your.
It is my. Yeah.
Yeah.
So who? Show of hands. Who's heard of No Mow May?
Oh look. There you go.
Oh, that's not bad. Okay, that's a relief. That's a relief. I think it's our 3rd year. Is that right, Ian? 3rd year of running this campaign. So Plantlife has, you know, has kind of championed the idea of trying to encourage people to leave any area of grass long, really. Whether it be in their garden or in a bit of public space, and quite a lot of local authorities have signed up to this now and are leaving areas long, and quite a lot of other national charities like I think the National Trust and other bigger organisations are starting to think about leaving areas of grass long, because we've got so much opportunity across the UK, you know, for wildflowers, and of course they're just constantly being cut. Yeah, so the campaign No Mow May goes all the way through May. And really it's a Kickstarter for another citizen science project that we have running in June, which is called Every Flower Counts. So you could go onto the Plantlife website and you could register if you've left an area of grass long for No Mow May. And the idea is we want people to register and then they can download some information, and we want them to count the number of wildflowers in a square in their patch, and we're kind of feeding that into a big citizen science project. And it's starting to tell us some really interesting things about lots of people's gardens and actually how many wildflowers there are in all sorts of places that we never even realised there were. So maybe Ian will talk a bit more about that.
Erin, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was Hugo's pop-up studio. So when he has to go out into a meadow, he takes his little studio with him. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so which leads on quite nicely to this one. This is the monkey orchid here, which is Drachea simia, the scientific name. And obviously it resembles little monkeys hanging off one another. Hence the common name. And sort of obviously these orchids especially are sort of very, very rare, and some of them are even on the red list. So you know, obviously you can't touch them. So it was sort of a combination of Hugo working with a plamp, which is a plant clamp, so it doesn't sort of move around with the wind, and it sort of is fixed in one place. So you can kind of get the stillness and the focus. Obviously, of all the sort of close-up shots, they sort of focus on the petals and the patterns that go in with, that go with it as well. So with the wind, even as you can see the sort of grass moving now, which would sort of not come out in a photograph very well. So his pop-up tents was sort of, it was as it's described, a pop-up tent in the middle of a field, and sort of most of the crew that were on the shoots had to wear slippers to sort of stop the vibration of when sort of you're walking around as well, especially with sort of these smaller close-up shots. But it was sort of on days like this, and also windy, cold, rainy days, sort of everyone huddling in these little pop-up tents, trying to sort of protect and sort of block the wind, almost like a wind barrier. So this is the monkey orchid close-up as and one of the light box shots for the monkey orchid.
So the light box was it? Did you take that and that was in the tent?
Yeah, that was sort of a light box sort of behind as well, and sort of afterwards editing. But it's mainly just sort of the lighting, on set, on the shoot itself.
Yeah. Is it? I don't know if you can answer this, but is it possible to get decent photographs just using our mobile phones? It is?
It is, I think, yeah, it is. Hugo does actually do both sometimes on shoots. He brings a camera which obviously produces much higher quality, so you can blow them up to this, you know, we've done exhibitions at the Garden Museum. We blew these kind of shots up to 2 meters, 2.5 meters, and obviously on an iPhone you're not going to get that quality. You're going to sort of, it's a small sort of JPEG file, but it's sort of, the bigger the camera and the better the camera, the bigger the file. But iPhones, they can, people already are. It's, and also it's a way of spreading awareness. People now know about these things. They're taking photos. It's you know, wildflowers is, you know, a tag on Instagram. People are sort of much more interested about, you know, and taking photos themselves of these flowers.
Interesting. And Matt, how much, have I asked this question, how much space do you need?
How much space? As little as much or as little as you have, I would say.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, wildflowers will pretty much grow. I mean, the most important thing probably is somewhere sunny. Most wildflowers that grow in meadows, we're here under the sun, you know, they don't tend to grow so well in, you know, wildflower meadow or meadow flowers tend to grow much better in full sunlight. There obviously are flowers that will grow in semi-shade, but they're not typically meadow flowers.
Right.
So yeah.
And sometimes I see sort of so-called wildflower meadows, and they've got clearly sort of things have been dropped into them, like say camasias or you know, plug plants. They've been. Yeah. Is that allowed? Are we allowed to do that?
God, that's a very contentious one, isn't it, to answer? I mean, I think from Plantlife's point of view, I mean, it depends on where we're talking about. If you're talking about in your garden, in, you know, in a personal space, I mean, putting whatever you like in your garden. You know, we're not the plant police. We're not going to come into your garden and start telling you not to plant those wildflowers. But in the wider countryside, obviously there are concerns about planting non-native species in the wider countryside, and I think we as an organisation generally encourage the use of native species, yeah, so native wildflowers, yeah, in the right, so it's the right plant in the right place. But in your garden, you do absolutely what you like. So of course people do kind of mix and match, don't they? And they put all sorts of weird and wonderful things into their wildflower areas, into, you know, and I guess that's not necessarily truly a wildflower meadow, but it's still something sort of more naturalistic planting. So, you know, you're sort of straying more into the sort of aesthetic, I guess, than the sort of truly wildflower meadow side of things. But yeah, we generally wouldn't encourage that in the wider countryside.
And one of the things that you said to me on the phone the other day, which I thought was really interesting, was that, you know, I was asking you what sort of questions people ask, and one of the things people do ask a lot is, you know, why have I got, you know, a troublesome plant, or I've got too many oxeye daisies? And I loved your response, which was that we mustn't think of a meadow as the garden. You know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, clearly a lot of people have got a real passion and interest in gardening, and they come to wildflowers from that gardening perspective, and that's great, isn't it? Because, you know, the more we can spread the word. But of course they also bring the baggage with them of gardening, and a wildflower meadow is not a garden. You know, it's a natural living, breathing thing, and it's kind of an interaction between the soil and the management and the fertility and how you manage it, and time as well. So, you know, I think probably my advice for most people that are concerned or worried about a particular plant being too many of that or too few of that is just to chill out. Just let it do its thing. I mean, you've got to think of a meadow as a long-term project. It's an endeavour. It's not something that's going to just happen overnight. You've probably got to sort of literally give yourself 10 years. Okay, so you've got to be somewhere for a long time, and you think, okay, I'm going to start this meadow, and I'm going to be consistent about the way I manage it. If I can manage it properly, and the management is as fundamental as trying to sow seed. Anyone can sow seed, you know, but it's that commitment to the regularity of management that makes these things work. So, and yeah, so just chill out. If you've got too many of one plant, that will happen one year, and maybe the season or the weather will be slightly different the next year, and another plant will be more dominant, and that, you know, meadows kind of wax and wane, and the wildflowers in them will do that, and that's kind of just what happens. So I think it's just kind of enjoy.
Lovely, thank you. So I think we're open to questions from the floor. Anybody got a question? Yes. Do.
What time of the year did you mow a wild meadow?
Well, there's a question. I mean, typically, traditional hay meadows and some of our most wildflower-rich hay meadows that we have in the countryside, you know, the wider countryside, would typically be cut probably late July, early August. But of course, you can be a bit flexible. I mean, what I would say is basically look at the flowers in there, and if those flowers are finished flowering and are starting to set seed, you can leave them. If you leave them through like August, the birds will start to eat some of those seed, and you'll have a whole new, you know, and there'll be loads of other insects using that as well. So, I mean, probably any time from August.
put your hand up if you've got a question. That might be a gentleman over there.
Did you worry about thistles
I knew someone would ask that. I think it depends. All these questions are caveated like that. It depends on so many things. It depends on how many you've got. I mean, potentially they can be a problem if you've got a whole field full of creeping thistle. That might not necessarily be the best place to start a wildflower meadow, because those plants can be quite dominant, and you might need to tackle that before trying to establish wildflowers. But of course, thistles in their own right are, you know, they're valuable for a whole load of things. So it depends on your perspective, I think. But yeah, I mean, in a wildflower context, if we've got a lot of thistle, it might be a problem. And the same with dock as well, can be a problem.
do they sort of work themselves out?
They can do over time, yeah. And certainly people, you know, I've heard from lots of people that have been managing meadows for maybe 20 or 30 years, and gradually, with the regularity of management, most of these problem plants tend to come into meadows that have had some damage to them at some point. Maybe they've been overgrazed, or there's been livestock in there at the wrong time of year and it's been too wet and they've created muddy patches, and of course the plants just take advantage of that muddy patch and they just come in. You know, so often docks and thistles and maybe ragwort come into fields. So often for us it's a sign that that field has been not so well looked after at some point in the past. We don't like to say that, obviously, never say that, but that's often the case.
As a gardener sat amongst 4 clients, I'm over here. Do you really have to use a scythe versus a strimmer?
Depends if you want to get your top off or not. No, not at all. No. I mean, lots of people use I mean, basically, however you get the grass, it's about getting the grass removed. That's the most important thing. So, however you do that, I mean, you can use a brush cutter. You can cut it by hand, obviously with a scythe. That's absolutely fine. I mean, one thing. And you can use, you know, you can use collectors, flail mowers that go, you know, small compact tractors. There's lots of different bits of equipment. You can use an Allen scythe, which is a reciprocal, you know, so depending on the size of the area you want to cut, you can use all sorts of equipment. I mean, one thing that sometimes is useful, that you maybe leave the grass there for a few days just to dry out a bit and let some of those seeds fall out of the grass before you then remove it all away. If you're not making hay, because if you were making hay, obviously that grass gets thrown around because the hay is dried and thrown around, and the seeds then fall out, obviously. But if you're just cutting it and removing it, leaving it for a few days, then it will do the same thing. So.
There's a microphone going round somewhere.
You can do. Here we go. I'll come to you next.
There must be some questions about photography, surely.
How invasive is yellow rattle?
How invasive?
Yes.
Well, I mean, yellow rattle is one of these quite interesting plants, and the populations tend to go up quite quickly in the first maybe 4 or 5 years once you establish and get it going in a meadow, and then they tend to start to drop normally, and it tends to find a bit of a balance and an equilibrium. Now, if I was managing a meadow purely for wildflowers, I wouldn't worry. I mean, if you're managing it for other reasons, and maybe you're trying to take a hay crop, that's a slightly different matter. But, you know, and if you're trying to use it more productively, you know, maybe yellow rattle's a concern. But most people, personally, I wouldn't worry. The populations will rise and fall, depending on, yeah. Have you got a particular situation in mind, or?
Well, we do have lovely meadows with wildflowers, and yet we've always heard that sort of thought it was good to have yellow rattle.
Yeah. I would say on balance it is.
You can see you can go around spreading it, but I'm wondering whether we'd be worse off because it would spread too much and take away other stuff.
No, generally not, no. I mean, and of course it's because it's an annual and it actually dies quite quickly. I mean, basically by July it'll be kind of brown, starting to die away. So, you know, all the perennials will still stay in there and persist. So generally it's a good thing. On balance, it's better to have it than not have it, I would say. And particularly on more fertile ground, it's better to have it because it helps to suppress the grass, which is the critical thing, really.
Hi Matt, sorry, it's another question for you. I was wondering, with the requirement for development to provide biodiversity net gain now, do you think that farmers perhaps with unproductive land might be looking to create meadows where they wouldn't be allowed to produce animal crops to use as sort of a biodiversity bank? Do you think we might see more of that, which would be a good thing?
with. Yeah, absolutely. And certainly Plantlife as an organisation is, is being approached more by people like that who are buying land and are thinking about doing that kind of thing. And both farmers and non-farmers buying up land and thinking, actually, there's an opportunity here, and there's obviously money coming from development, and I can do something more, more positive with that land. And that's definitely part of the conversation, the idea of biodiversity net gain. And I think, one of the positives about it is that there will be a commitment on that piece of land for quite a long time, maybe up to 30 years. And obviously managing a meadow is, as I said, is quite a long-term endeavour. So, if you can get commitment from landowners for that long, and they get paid as well for that long, that's much more likely to end up with better wildflower meadows in the countryside. I think, there's still detail there. There's devil in the detail, but I think generally it's actually a positive thing.
Hi, I have a question. If you have a meadow that is all grass now, but you'd like to turn it into a wild meadow, wildflowers, do I have to, cut the grass, turn it over, try to remove it, or do I have seed with wildflowers? How would I go about starting a wildflower meadow?
Okay. Well, if I take this field here as an example of maybe your little patch, and it's mostly dominated by grass, is that right? Would that be a fair sort of assumption? It somewhat depends on the kind of grass that's growing and the species of grass, because some grasses are much faster growing and what we would call coarser grasses, and they're just big bullies and they just grow really fast and they just take up lots of space. So one thing is to try and understand exactly what species of grass you've got, which sometimes can be tricky, depending on, but generally in this situation we wouldn't turn over the soil. We would we would sow in late summer, early autumn. That's the best time to sow wildflowers. Generally the spring's not a very good time to sow wildflowers, generally, because it gets dry. And then if you've got tiny little seedlings and suddenly we get a dry summer, they're going to really struggle for water. And of course, naturally, wildflowers, if you imagine in the natural cycle, they fall out of the flower in the late summer onto the ground, and they germinate through the autumn and the winter typically. So that's, we're kind of trying to mimic the sort of natural cycle of things. So you want to get the grass very, very short, and you'd cut everything away in the late summer. And remove everything, and then you want to scarify somehow. So, and again, do people know what I mean by scarify? It's basically kind of scrape away all the dead grass and actually just kind of create some bare ground on the grass. So rather than ploughing it or cultivating it, you're just kind of scratching up the surface. And there are scarifying machines that you can hire or you can buy, or you get someone to do that for you. And it's just creating some bare ground, because those seeds need to make contact with soil. Because a lot of people think, I'll just scatter my seeds in the grass, and of course grass like this, they're just not going to do. The seeds need to make contact with soil just like any other seed, and they need to have some space as well to germinate. So that activity of getting the grass short and then scarifying and creating that bare soil, it does two things. It creates the bare ground for the seed to fall into, but it also kind of suppresses the grass for maybe 5 or 6 weeks as well. Surprising how much you can really like hammer grass and it doesn't kill it. Can really do that to grass, and it'll grow back within 6 weeks. It'll be green again. So the more you can do that in that early stage when you're sowing, the more chance of those seeds germinating. So that's the first step. So get the grass short, scarify it to create bare ground, sow the seeds, and they're just literally scattered on the surface. And normally if you're in a sort of small space, you then maybe just tread them in with your feet, or like a garden roller or something like that, just to press them into the surface. And then ideally over the next sort of 3 or 4 months through the autumn and into the winter, you'd want to try and keep the grass really short in that area, because the grass will grow back, and within 3 or 4 weeks it'll start to be growing back again. And the more you can keep that grass short in those early days when those seeds are starting to germinate, the more chance of actually a bit of success. So that's the kind of process.